very much, Ellen. Thank you. Thank you. Well, my name is James Hyder, and I'm the editor and publisher of LF Examiner, which is a business newsletter that covers... Can you all hear me all right? Okay. I'm editor and publisher of LF Examiner, a newsletter that covers this business. I'm not a filmmaker, although I did work in audio and visual production way back in the pre-digital era. But the last actual film I personally made myself was a 16mm black and white project in college in 1982. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm any expert, and you've been hearing from experts and will continue to hear from experts in the technical and artistic aspects of making films. So I'm here to talk about the business of giant screen films, which is a little bit funny because I have even less experience in actually doing production or fundraising of giant screen films, but I guess they couldn't find anybody else, so they had to settle with me. But I have been in the business for 35 years. For the first 12, I worked at the National Air and Space Museum. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm running, good grief, what happened here? Have I been pushing this button by mistake? I apologize. For the first 12 years, I worked at the National Air and Space Museum, where I managed the IMAX theater there, which is at the time the most popular IMAX theater and the most popular museum in the world. In addition to that, I worked on developing a business plan for a giant screen film distribution office, which unfortunately the Smithsonian did not go ahead and do, or I might still be doing that now. I was also worked on the committee that helped to make 3 or 4 of the films that the museum participated in. This is advancing without my knowledge. What's going on? Can somebody help me here? Is there a timer going on here?
James, you keep talking about it.
Okay, thanks. There seems to be but I won't take credit for the Oscar nomination that Cosmic Voyage earned just because I was on the committee that helped make it. There we go. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Apologize for the little mix-up there. After leaving the museum in 1996, I started this newsletter. And I've been publishing now for 22 years. So if nothing else, I've been around for quite a while. I've seen a lot. I know where some of the bodies are buried, at least. And I've done my best to collect and disseminate as much information as I could. So, how to make a small fortune as a giant screen filmmaker. Sorry. So you probably know the basic outlines of how Hollywood makes films, and you can try and do this yourself if you like, but I'm not sure. You start with $200 million for your budget, no problem, right? You'll get to your studio to put in another $100 million for marketing. You'll open in 5,000 screens domestically, 15,000 screens internationally. You'll run for 6 weeks. You'll make $500 million, and at the end of that, you declare a loss. The giant screen world is completely different from that, with the possible exception of declaring losses. So your budget may be in the neighborhood of about $5 million, if you're lucky these days. You might get to be able to spend $50,000, $100,000 on marketing. Other people may tell me I'm wrong about this, but this is basically what I've heard. Over the course of the run, you'll be in perhaps 130 screens, maybe more if you're lucky, maybe not. But your run will be 5 to 10 years, not 6 weeks. You might gross somewhere in the neighborhood of $33 million. This is a figure I've gotten from various sources. It's a rough, all these numbers, by the way, are going to be very rough. And at the end, you'll declare a loss. Okay, I'm joking about that. Many of these films do well, so that's an easy joke, but I couldn't avoid it. But perhaps the biggest difference between Hollywood and the giant screen world is the issue of screens, because they are about 1,000 times larger than we are. Not quite 200,000 screens, but pretty close. At the moment, we have 227, okay? So about 1,000 times bigger. And then there's also the question of the box office split. You probably know that when a film shows in the multiplexes, for the first couple of weeks, the studio gets 90% or more. Over the run, the sliding scale drops down, and eventually the studios and the theaters split roughly 50-50. In our business, for historical reasons primarily, it's more like 75 for the theaters, 25 for the distributor and producer. And this is primarily because, unlike the studios, we're not doing huge international marketing campaigns. The studio, the distributor rather, is not doing huge international marketing campaigns. They provide materials to the theaters, but basically most of the marketing is left for the theater to do at the local level. And for that reason, historically, the theaters have taken the largest share of the pie. They have the local media connections, and they know how to do it. And of course, they're not opening simultaneously all around the world. So that's another difference. But one of the biggest problems we're facing now, unfortunately, is the decline in the number of giant screen theaters worldwide. Here's the chart showing the count over the past 40 years. As you can see, in 2006, we peaked at about 276 screens. Today, that number, as I mentioned, is 227. And this is actually a somewhat generous number because it includes a number of theaters that are essentially inactive or only show a film once or twice a week and only show a film that they bought and paid for years and years ago, and that's it. So the actual market for your new films that you're making now is probably quite a bit lower than that. Under 200, maybe in the range of 150 to 200 if you're lucky. So this is a problem. And another problem is the fact that attendance in the museums and science centers that these theaters are mostly in has been either flat or even declining for a few years. Things may be turning around a little bit. I've heard some signs of that. But as those numbers have declined, and therefore the income has declined, the theaters have become much more risk averse. Theater managers have never been known for their wild risk-taking behavior. Except at the bar and parties afterwards, that's right, and dancing. But now they need to make sure that any film that they book is really going to meet their needs, really going to do what they need it to do. It also happens to be the case that income from ancillary sources is not as good as it once was. A few years ago, when 3D TV looked like it was going to be the next big thing, quite a number of giant screen distributors had lots of ready-made 3D content available and were able to sell it to those platforms. That, of course, as we know, faded out. It also happens to be the case that physical media like Blu-ray and DVD are also fading out in favor of streaming. We now have one potential market of 4K streaming and possibly higher levels of resolution streaming coming along, but unfortunately the giant screen world there does not have as much of a lock on pre-recorded 4K content as we did with 3D, where we were one of the very few places that had content available that people would just snap right up. So 4K is a market, 4K streaming is a market. We can all debate and argue about whether it's worth trying to put a giant screen film on a 4K monitor, better than an iPhone, I guess. So we have a lot of challenges in this business, but let's soldier on and see what we can do. How much are you going to spend for your film? Roughly speaking, the budgets seem to have ranged in the recent years between $2 and $8 million. There's a lot of variances in here. There's a lot of differences. The most expensive film that I know of from any sort of authoritative source in the last 20 years, not even, it's more than 20 years now, Wings of Courage in 1995. Mark was involved in that. Jean-Jacques Hano, who also had produced Quest for Fire and The Name of the Rose, made this film, 50-minute drama, produced entirely in 1570 3D, every frame. And he was at a conference in Poitiers, France with us, and he said, I can't tell you what the budget was, but I can tell you I spent as many millions as I had perforations. So $15 million. I don't know of any giant screen films that have been more expensive than that. Does anybody here tell me there's anything more than 15 million?
T-Rex was about the same.
Was it? Okay. So, but even going over 10 million has been quite rare in our business. That has happened, but is quite rare. And lately, not hardly at all. Now, on the other end, I was just talking to Luc Ployhar yesterday, and he allowed me to tell you about this. He produced Space Next and Touch the Stars, which we just saw this week. And because he has his own in-house, he has his own production house, and the films are almost entirely CGI, he says that it's hard to come up with an actual number, but his cost, he thinks, is roughly in the order of $1 million. Okay, so he did no original shooting. He got materials, some live-action footage from outside sources, but he basically produced the entire film himself in-house. In the case of Space Next, he said it was over 5 years. In the case of Touch the Stars, over 2 years. And did it for about $1 million each. Now, that's extremely rare. That's not likely to happen. It's not. And he's being successful from a business point of view. So there's one end and there's the other end. You will probably fall in the middle somewhere, but if you're taking cameras out somewhere, I can pretty much guarantee you're not going to do it for $1 million. So let's assume a nice round number of 5 million. Where are you going to get the money? So there are three basic sources. They are equity partners, non-equity funders, and people who are somewhere in the middle. So who may want some of their money back, but won't be terribly upset if they don't get all of it. They have other reasons. Back in the old days, films were made with straight investor cash. For instance, the Destination films, Destination Cinema, produced Grand Canyon Adventure and, sorry, not Grand Canyon Adventure, Grand Canyon Mystery Myth, Grand Canyon, and that's right, thank you. And made built a theater there and at Niagara, and made a film about Niagara with the idea that all the tourists would come and see it. And this was a pure business deal. They had no intention originally, at least with Grand Canyon, of distributing this film. So it was just a matter, let's make a film, let's build a theater, and it has been very successful for them for more than 20 years, almost 30 years, I think, at least. But that was long ago, and there have been a few other films made entirely with investor cash, but these days that would be very, very rare. And the main reason is that if you're trying to make money, there are far better ways, far easier ways, less risky ways of making money than trying to make a successful giant screen film. I know, but if you have, maybe you have a rich uncle who will, give you $5 million. So what we're coming then to is what Jonathan said in this session in 2015. The bottom line is, do not try to make these films unless you're prepared to go and look for money that is not about getting an economic return. So-called free money can take the form of either grants, and the largest supporter of grants in our business for the last 2 decades at least has been the National Science Foundation. They've supported a couple dozen films at this point, usually in the order of $1 to $2 million, maybe a little bit more per film. The Advanced Informal STEM Learning Program is the division of NSF that does these grants, and they have a fairly rigorous set of guidelines and requirements and procedures before it'll make a grant, and they're all intended to make sure that you fulfill their mandate. You have to have a number of scientific advisors, you have to have a comprehensive educational package, and you also have to conduct formative and summative testing, audience testing, to make sure that you're actually meeting your intended educational goals. All this is fairly complicated. It's not easy or cheap. There are specialists, grant writers, who will help you with an application process. There are consultants who can help you with the educational testing. And by the way, you will need to do educational materials whether you're going for a grant or not. Educational materials are a requirement for pretty much every giant screen film. I'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. Tax breaks have become a much more important source of giant screen funding in recent years, and they've contributed to quite a few productions that we've seen lately. Basically, a local, a regional, or even a national government will give filmmakers a break or even a rebate generally in return for filming in the given area, and they usually require that the production company or one of the production companies be based in that country or region as well. Australia, for instance, Miles was mentioning this before, I didn't know about the 60%, but Australia has a program that will rebate up to 40% of production spending for films that are made to show in cinemas. The deal for television productions is only 20%. France, Mexico, and Canada, and several other countries and several US states offer similar incentives. And there are incentives, that Miles was saying, for post-production work as well. So like grants, these programs have various requirements and qualification and application process that can be somewhat time-consuming and complex. But as with the grants, you don't have to pay this money back. This is quote-unquote free money, except for the cost of getting it. So, has anyone here seen To Fly? Anyone here? Okay. Does anybody remember the very first title card, before you see any image at all, the very first title card? Anybody remember what that said? Conoco. Presented as a public sponsor, there's David, he remembers, presented as a public sponsor by Conoco, a public service by Conoco. And surprisingly, it really was a public service. It was not a marketing effort. They weren't trying to sell the audience anything. There was no product placement. I wasn't there at the Air and Space Museum in 1976 when the film opened, but my boss, who was the theater's first manager, was. He tells a story about how after the film had been running there for sellout crowds at about $1 per ticket for the first year, he called his contact at Conoco and he said, "I have a check for you." And the Conoco guy said, "What check?" He says, "Conoco's share of the box office." He says, "What am I going to do with that?" They didn't want the money. They didn't expect the money. They had no place to put it. They didn't take the money. Back in the early days, several giant screen films were funded 100% as true public services by corporate sponsors who didn't expect to be repaid, didn't want to be repaid. Those are the good old days. So I'm afraid I can't offer you much hope of finding that kind of corporate partner today. They may be out there. I think somebody would have found one by now if they were, but it's not unlikely. And finding any corporate sponsor is not going to be very easy. It's probably common to spend as much time securing sponsorships and funding as it is to make your films, or sometimes a lot more, as we've heard from the folks earlier today. Conoco, back in the old days, sponsored 2 or 3 films, as I recall. Lockheed funded 7 or 8 space films, and I just remember Greg had just mentioned the other day that he's now made a deal for sponsorship with Brand USA for 3 projects. But here's what you're going to need. Here's what your sponsors want from you. They want both your audience and the venue. The giant screen audience is relatively affluent. It's well-educated. And it's family-oriented, with a very wide age range, as we were saying before, that runs from small children and their parents to their grandparents, 8 to 80, as somebody mentioned. And the theaters are also very desirable. They're well-respected institutions that offer prestige, strong local connections to the community, and scientific credibility that the sponsors value highly. The GSA has done research on the characteristics of giant screen audiences that you can use to help make your pitches to potential sponsors. But you really need to look for, as people were mentioning in the previous session, sponsors with a strong connection to your message. Recent films have been sponsored by car makers, sporting good makers, and other consumer product manufacturers. I think one of the greatest examples of sponsorship deal in giant screen history is Bugs, produced by Jonathan Barker and Phil Strother, and sponsored by Terminix. Okay, how often does a sponsorship deal get that sort of approving laughter? It was a great deal. Phil, it worked well for you? Yes. With the right kind of connection between your film and your sponsor, the film can be worked into the sponsor's international marketing campaigns, which would generate huge exposure that would otherwise cost you millions of dollars. There can be great synergy between sponsors and theaters with respect to premiere events in the theaters, with respect to local stores or dealerships, with company experts who can come and speak to groups at your theaters, and so on. But I want to change tack here and say the most important thing is you've got to find a distributor first. I think most of the filmmakers in this business would agree that the connection to your distributor is extremely important. In other sessions, people will tell you that you should bring in an experienced cinematographer and experienced sound recordist early in the process, and the same is true of a distributor. Successful giant screen films have many specialized requirements, as we've been discussing in the previous session, and the further along you are in making your film before you get a distributor, the more expensive and painful it may be to fix the things that will need to be changed to make your film succeed in our market. If you have a completed film that doesn't meet the special needs of giant screen theaters, you'll probably have a very hard time finding a distributor or getting the film in theaters. The existing giant screen distributors have the experience to know what works and what doesn't work in our strange little business. Please don't make the mistake of, which we've seen many times, of making a film and then thinking, well, why not throw it up in giant screen theaters? There are many reasons why it's unlikely to succeed, and it doesn't have that much to do with cameras or framing. It actually all comes down to standardized testing in middle schools. Here's how it works. Most giant screen theaters are located in museums and science centers. School groups are these theaters' largest single market. School groups will only come to museums if the visit meets their needs. It's very difficult for teachers to get permission to take a school on a field trip these days. They need to have the students pass the standardized tests. If the film that they're going to see helps them pass a standardized test, if it meets the curriculum requirements of a standardized test, the school can bring their kids to the theater, and if that happens, then the theater will book the film. So it doesn't really matter. Oh, and by the way, it's middle school. It's not elementary school. It's not high school. Those groups don't go to the giant screen theaters. And it doesn't really matter how good your film is. If you don't check off the curriculum boxes, theaters will be very reluctant to book it. You're not, as somebody was saying earlier, you're not marketing. You have three audiences. You're not marketing to the viewers, though. You're marketing to the managers. They are the gatekeepers, a term we use frequently for theater managers in this business. And here's an object lesson. In the last 30 years, these 40 years, these 9 films have been nominated for Academy Awards, mostly for Best Short Documentary or Best Short Film. Only one has won an Oscar. The Best Animated Short in 2000, Old Man and the Sea, animated by Alexander Petrov. It's a magical, beautiful, wonderful film. It's extraordinary. It's probably one of the greatest experiences I've seen in giant screen. It didn't fit into the curriculum needs of schools. It got almost no bookings. So if you can imagine anything better as a marketing tool than winning an Oscar, I have at it, but I can't. And yet this film did not succeed in giant screen theaters, despite being a fantastic film. So your distributor has the experience to shape your film to meet the criteria that the schools need. They can help you with your funding. They know the theater managers, the 150 or so theaters that are likely to take your film, because in our business, booking is pretty much one-on-one retail business. You can't go in like the studios and talk to one guy at an exhibitor and make 1,000 bookings at once. It's all one-on-one. And your distributor will also help you make the educational materials that you'll need to pass on to the school groups, the teachers, before they come. So please make finding a distributor one of your top priorities. I have an apology to make. I made this slide late last night, and I left one off. I apologize to Cosmic Picture. Somehow I had an old list, and I realized as we were sitting here this morning, you guys got up Cosmic Picture. So here are distributors plus Cosmic Picture in our business. And my sincere apologies to John and Mark about this. And finally, if you haven't already, and I presume by being here that you probably have, join the GSCA. The GSCA has tremendous resources available to you. The Theater Attendance Reporting Program has been mentioned. Now, although this is a voluntary program, so we don't have a complete participation, so it's not as ideal as we'd like, but it still gives you a rough glimpse into what's going on in terms of patterns and trends with attendance. You have previous sessions, like this session in 2015. Jonathan Barker was there, and Lisa Truitt, Paul Fraser organized it and gave a much more detailed idea of pro formas for giant screen budgets, giant screen film budgets. So that's available online at the GSCA website. The audience research survey that was done in 2014, I mentioned before, gives you some characteristics of what the giant screen audiences are like. Materials that were from previous conferences available online that could help you with issues like marketing. And of course, come to the conferences to meet your colleagues who, as we've been saying, are all pretty much friendly and helpful, except of course for Mark Katz. In short, making giant screen films is not a simple process. It's not quick, it's not easy, and it's not for the faint of heart. But when it's done right, it's magical, and it's one of the greatest experiences available. How else can we take a ride on the space shuttle, or dive to the bottom of the ocean, or fly with the Blue Angels, or travel to the South Pole? The smaller screens can't do it. iPhones don't do it. Only the giant screen can make us feel like we're in those places and doing those things. Sadly, you will not become rich doing it. Jonathan Barker and others have said, we're not in this for the money, but because of the unique experience that it creates, and inspiring and educating and thrilling people around the world. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll do my best. I'll do my best to answer any questions, and I'll probably pass on these questions to most of the people in the room here who know more than I do about this. I'll also accept corrections for what I said. from people like Diane, who's probably going to say I was wrong about the school groups or other things.
Well, James, thank you. You're so prescient. A couple of comments. One, I do think the marketing budget shown for the GS film is extremely modest, and so I think that number definitely has to be, much larger, more like not 50,000, but 250 to 300,000 minimum. So the museums, the exhibitors require a lot of materials, and so just not to under budget that. There is a new survey being done by GSCA, so there should be some new data on attendance and that. I guess just a warning I want to give about NSF grants, because I think everyone gets very excited about NSF grants. I'm currently the principal investigator of the NSF grant for Amazon Adventure. And I'd say it's very hard to get the funding, and if you hear a number of a grant, say for $3 million, and your eyes light up, probably only $2 million of it goes to the film, and at least $1 million goes to everything else that James mentioned. In addition to the education and evaluation, which is external third-party evaluation, there's a requirement now that there's a research component. So there has to be something researched, and I'll be happy to talk to people about that later on. But again, it takes a great deal of effort and work to do the actual grant, and then the compliance is very challenging. So,
and just yesterday I saw a headline, I didn't read the article, I saw a headline that President Trump is planning to cut $1 billion from the NSF budget. So there you go.
So it just got 100 times harder.
Well, I have a question about the cost of post-production. How much would you budget, like for a nature film without any special effects, 45 minutes long, roughly?
Okay, I wouldn't budget anything because I'm not the filmmaker, so I'll ask anybody here in the room who can give you better advice on that. I don't have, again, one of the problems in this industry is that we've not been very forthcoming. We're very friendly, we're very helpful, we'll talk to each other, but we're not very forthcoming with a lot of numbers, and that's been one of the frustrations in my 22 years of covering this as a journalist, is that people treat a lot of numbers as private and secret. And in Hollywood, we get all the box office numbers day by day for the entire country, the entire world. But here, we're a little bit more closed-mouthed about money. So I'll let anybody else who wants to take that question.
They are more sacred than the sacred master.
There's so many people who can speak to this, and I think that you should disagree with what we have to say, but one of the tricks is what is post-production, what's distribution. So that's the first part of this. There are so many deliverables these days, and there used to be a lot, but I can say from personal experience, I was absolutely shocked at, we're trying to keep every theater happy, and so we should, but we're delivering laser squeeze, laser normal, we're delivering 185 DCI compliant, 19 xenon, we're delivering for small screens, we're delivering for dome laser, we're delivering for dome film. So is that post, is that distribution? That's something that every filmmaker wrestles with. As far as numbers go, I cannot see post being done for anything under $1 million. That is my own feeling. I think it could go up to 3. And I include in that conversion. So you have to decide, is it worth it to shoot native stereo? There's a variety of points of view on this. I can tell you that for Superpower Dogs, we carried a rig around the world. 9.5 minutes of native ended up in that film. The rest was conversion. I think the conversion is fantastic, but it ain't cheap. So you can look at anywhere from, and there's a lot of vendors in the room, something between $15,000 to $30,000 per minute for conversion, and just allow yourself a lot of time to do it right. I think everyone would agree. It's all about time. So post is not to be taken lightly, and there's some phenomenal post supervisors in the room as well. Anyone else want to challenge those numbers based on experience?
Thank you, Daniel, for sharing that. We'll go to Phil Strother.
30 seconds.
I think just to divide that up slightly, I think if you've got a film that you're going to shoot 100% native, that cost is elsewhere in the budget by the expense of having two cameras. Yes, it's expensive to post in 3D, but most of the expense effectively is in the 2D to 3D production conversion that Daniel was talking about, which would be anywhere between 500,000 and 1.5 million, depending on whether you're on that 15 to 30 odd. A current budget that I have with on-site is substantially less than that. It includes a couple of minutes, 4 or 5 minutes of conversion. That is weighing in at $520,000. But if you are then going to convert, that's what helps you get up to, but that's a largely native film. But if I had to convert the whole of the film, that would be an additional cost.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. One final word of advice. I can tell you for sure that every single successful producer of giant screen films has one thing in common. They subscribe to LF Examiner.